So, following the book bag knitting video, I had a request in the comments for how to read and knit. Now, this is done in 2 key steps. The first is easier said than done, but you need to learn to knit without looking. Pretty much anytime you want to be able to read and do a task at the same time, you need to be able to do said task by feel, whether it's crochet or sewing or knitting. As such, I don't recommend this when you're knitting a very fiddly pattern. Even one where you need to count the stitches becomes a little bit more difficult. A lot of this comes down to just having the confidence to look away. Especially if you've been knitting for a while, you probably instinctively know how it feels to knit, but you don't generally want to look away because you want to watch what you're doing. I learned to do this from a tutorial that Kristen Lehrer put up on Woolen Vine Yarns. I highly recommend going and watching that video because she does a great job of really breaking it down. She's been knitting without looking at her hands for a lot longer than I have. But I do want to still show you the changes that I made to my knitting because it does actually change between when I'm looking and when I'm not looking, as well as how I set up my book so that I can read and knit comfortably for hours on end. So I can comfortably knit, purl, slip, and yarn over without looking. For reference, I knit continental, and I use the Norwegian purl, which looks like that. But this should work with any style of knitting. The first thing you want to do when you're learning to knit without looking is to just sort of slow down and learn how it feels when you knit. Get a feel for the tension, what it feels like when you pick up a stitch, and the tension, which I can usually feel here and here. The slight tug of the yarn being successfully wrapped around, which you can see moves my index finger. And then how far I go to slip it off, and the tug and sort of rough give of the work that's not too far, or this being stretched off my needle tips. I also tend to hold my needles just a little further away from the tips than if you were speed knitting. I find the tension and the yarn feel changes a bit based on your fiber. So in particular, wool generally feels a bit different to cotton and linen because wool has more give to it. But it usually just takes knitting a few times while watching to get the hang of what it feels like. Now, to better feel the stitches, I actually change my hand position slightly. I go from this, where I can knit for speed and my fingers aren't going to get in the way, to this, where I can use my fingers to better feel what I'm doing and make sure I'm doing the right thing, thus making less mistakes. I keep my left index finger flat against my work as a kind of guard. Now, I particularly do this when knitting and reading because I don't want to have to think about anything that I'm doing with my knitting while reading, and I want to be able to entirely focus on the story. I use the pad of my index finger to make sure I'm catching the yarn, as well as make sure that I'm not slipping off an extra stitch accidentally. For purling, I use the same finger to just sort of make sure that I'm catching everything correctly, and I'll use my thumb to indicate, yes, I have entered that stitch, I can feel it there. Then I can feel that I'm catching the yarn on my index finger and then slipping it off and making sure I'm not slipping off this next stitch. Let me undo those stitches quickly. For slipping stitches, I again use my thumb to feel if I've caught the stitch in the same way that I do for purling, because you're entering in with a purl. I can feel it here, and then I'll just slip it off, and then can swap between knitting and purling. So knitting, I rely more on my index finger. Purling, I rely more on my thumb, at least in terms of entering the stitch. And just to explain that, if I catch 2 stitches, that feels different to catching this. You can see that my stitches can't move as freely, and I can feel that tug, versus this, which feels a lot more free, and I can feel that it moves easily. This does just take a bit of practice and confidence. Now, I said that I don't recommend knitting and reading when you have to count stitches, and I stand by this, having tried to do it. I find it just pulls you out of the immersive experience of reading, but if you are knitting at very regular intervals each round or row, like every 7 knit stitches, you're going to purl the 8th. You can use stitch markers to help you feel that without having to count it. I also recommend that you do check your work every round or so just to make sure you haven't made major mistakes and you're not going to have to rip back. But I do find that knitting without looking opens up a lot of brain space, and it's also how I can now knit in cars as someone who generally gets car sick. Once you've mastered this, or at least gotten the hang of it, you can go on to step 2. Setting up your book so you can see it over your knitting. This is where I do find my e-reader is a lot easier to work with since I don't have to prop the pages open. I personally like my book to sit around eye level, which generally gives me enough room to move my arms a little bit while knitting and doesn't crunch me into a weird position that could cause strain on my wrist. I found 2 pillows works pretty well, and I like to smoosh the top one a little bit so I can easily prop my book up and happily go along knitting and reading. If I'm reading from a physical book, I try to gently prop something to keep the pages open or try to wedge some of the pillow in between if I'm not using my round pillow. If you do this often enough, you could probably rig up a hands-free reading stand like a music stand or even one of those pyramid tablet pillows. This is absolutely the easier step of the 2, and that is it. If you want more advice on how to knit without looking, I highly recommend going and checking out Kristen Lehrer's video on it. And if you like this video, you can check out my other videos. And if you really like this video, you can feel free to subscribe. I hope you have a lovely week. Bye!